All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Emma. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library, and we are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's event. I'm happy to hop right into it and turn it right over to today's speaker. Greg Marley has been collecting, studying, eating, growing, and teaching about mushrooms for almost 50 years. He spreads his love of mushrooms to hundreds throughout walks, talks, and classes across New England. Marley is the author of Mushrooms for Health, Medicinal Secrets of Northeastern Fungi, and the award-winning Chanterelle Dreams, Amantia Nightmares, The Love, Lore, and Mystic of Mushrooms. As a volunteer mushroom identification consultant to poison centers across New England, he provides expertise in mushroom poisoning cases. When not mushrooming, Marley works as a mental health clinician and consultant specializing in suicide prevention. And I will turn it over to Greg. Go right ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Em. And thanks again. I always like partnering with Rockland Public Library because even if I go down there to present, it's only a 5-minute walk from home. And they've always been good friends. So, and welcome folks who are interested in mushrooms from wherever. And I know some of you are scattered around the state. In short, I've been playing with mushrooms for almost 50 years. And some of that I'm happy to share with you tonight as in this talk. And we're going to dive right in pretty quickly. We're going to start just as I often do, kind of looking at the variety and beauty of mushrooms, and then get into a little bit more of the meat around forest ecology and some of the roles. Feel free. I'm going to be trying to monitor the chat as we go. I may not address any or many of the questions that come in to the chat, but I'll try and keep my eye on them to see where curiosity is going and work to try and save some time at the end to take questions verbally from the extroverts and through the chat for the introverts. And we'll get it going. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I probably will keep that screen going for quite a while. If at any time you feel like I'm showing something or I'm talking about something that's not showing, let me know, because sometimes things get mistaken. So I always feel like, and less, but I've always felt like it's important to start out most conversations about mushroom, acknowledging that here in America, land of the free and home of the mycophobes, many of us were raised fearing mushrooms. We get calls all the time still about how do I get all those mushrooms out of my yard? And people want to avoid them or kick them or mow over them and not slow down enough to admire their beauty and their mystery and the potential for edibility. In short, so many people view all mushrooms that they don't buy tidily wrapped in cellophane in the grocery store. We view them as toadstools. So this one, I'm almost certain, is a toadstool because there's the toad, you know it. But for me, from the very beginning, mushrooms were a gateway. And we can call it a gateway drug. It's a gateway into nature. It's a gateway into beauty and quiet and solitude and peace and exploration, both, intellectual and gastronomic. They are a place I have always gone to re-ground myself, to find myself. And I love, this is an Asian poet. He says, the forest makes your heart gentle. You become one with it. No place for greed or anger here. And to me, that's what it's all about, at the heart. And since I am an intellectual person, it's always been a place of pursuit of knowledge as well. And since I am an inveterate cook and lover of fine food, early on, mushrooming became something of a gastronomic exploration. And every year, I probably eat, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 45 different species of wild mushrooms. And I am conservative. I'm intensely aware of toxic mushrooms. As Em said, I'm I have consulted with the poison centers across New England for many years in cases of mushroom poisoning and provide training and education around that issue. So I track toxic mushrooms as closely as I track edible mushrooms, and always I track beauty. But first and foremost, entering into that world of mystery. Many people have no idea that I do this mushroom thing, but I also work in mental health and suicide prevention. In fact, most of the time, that's the land I engage in. Prevention, response, coordination in the aftermath of suicides. So for me, going into the forest truly is a place of quietude, a place of peace, a place of beauty and mystery, watching the sun flow through this random spider web, just gorgeous. And always, the color, the variety, the form, the mystery, the architecture of mushrooms draw me in every day. And last year, if you were alive and breathing and had your eyes open and were outside, you likely saw more mushrooms, more variety, more abundance than probably any year you've been alive, because it was just that year. All of the forces came together in a wonderful way. So many of these pictures are some that I took last summer. Anything you see with this gorgeous blue knife, I definitely took last summer. So coral mushrooms and purple lacaria, just the gorgeous last spring as I was out searching for morels, which for many people are a hunt and frustration. For me, I've learned enough to find them. I also come upon, discarded bird's nests from the year before. And so it was a perfect nestle this little yellow morel inside the bird's nest for a photograph. And oddly enough, in one small location, and I think it works well because it has a fairly limestone-based sweet soil, I find these three different forms of spring mushrooms: two false morels and a true morel, the yellow morel on the right-hand side. The one in the middle, I've only found in a couple of places in Maine. Is called Gyromitra corfii. There's a couple other common names for it further south. It's actually eaten. And the one on the left is the true kind of false morel that's much more common in Maine than the true morels, and is quite toxic. You can steam and boil it out, but it's not one that would ever be on my list of edibility, because it can be quite dangerous. And then as we move further into the summer, you see it's just some of the beautiful, beautiful colors and forms. The American Caesar mushroom, I live here in Rockland. I don't find it on the coast. I don't think I've ever seen it in Knox County, but I find it in central Maine, Kennebec, Androscoggin, pretty commonly Somerset occasionally. And it's just this gorgeous, bright orange amanita that erupts from this egg that's just glorious. It's one of the only amanitas I have ever eaten. The amanita is the home of the most toxic mushrooms we have, and some of the majority of mushroom deaths across the world come from people who've eaten a few species of amanita. And then just gorgeous, just the mystery. And I don't know how you even acknowledge the beauty of this. This is called the Dyer's Polypore. And you find it's a parasite on conifers. And it can become, sometimes I find them 15, almost 20 inches in diameter. And just the beauty of that is gorgeous. So mushrooms come all kinds of shapes, all kinds of colors, and just an amazing array of forms of distributing spores. We talked about the false morel, the toxic one that's common in the spring here. And then there's things like the dog stinkhorn. And you can know why it's called the dog stinkhorn. It could be almost called the dog penis stinkhorn because of its form and its color. and the stink part becomes that dark, slimy gleba at the tip of each of the fruiting bodies. As it matures, start to smell very, very powerfully negative. They stink, and they draw in flies that eat that gleba, which is full of spores, and then distribute the spores out into the world. Quite odd and magical, I think. And then, I was working up in right on the kind of the border between Washington and Hancock County, up in Steuben, teaching a 5-day workshop we do up there. And I came upon this arc of glorious orange hiddenellum. And, they were so fresh and soft. They kind of looked like a mixture of fluff. And remember that orange dreamsicles you used to buy as a popsicle as a kid? It just looked exactly like that, so gloriously pretty. And there were probably 50 of them arcing across this area. So mushrooms come in all sizes, all shapes, all colors, many forms, from these tiny, tiny little coprinellus, which was just growing on some dung of a deer. And the one that you're seeing here, the cap of it is probably about almost between 1/8 and 1/4 inch in diameter. And then on the other side, you get these giant puffballs in Hand of the Woods, which may grow up to 30 inches in diameter, the puffball, and be quite dense and lovely and edible when they're fresh, and then very messy when they get old. This is my son. He probably doesn't like this photograph because it was taken a while ago, I think about 2009. He's a bit older now. And then just more beauty. The yellow morels, and you can see here in Maine, the yellow morels, Morchella esculenta, in that group, they fruit about the same time the lilacs are in bloom and the apple blossoms are open. So sometime around peaking mid to late May, and then into early June, depending upon how cool or warm the weather is. And the glorious bloody cortinarius, and this, I know, the one on the bottom right, not a mushroom, but just gorgeous, huh? Red eft, it's called. All kinds of colors across the rainbow, all kinds of shapes, some spotted, some smooth, some hairy, some shaggy, many of them called toadstools. And why do you think? Why would a toad be attracted to a mushroom? Because as a mushroom ages, it becomes a vector for various insects that feed on it and lay their eggs on it, and then their maggots chew through them, and the toads are there to collect the mushrooms. One summer, I was on a hunt for the white-lipped snail, Neohelix albularis, because a friend of mine who's an author wanted to photograph them for a movie she was doing based on her book, and she needed some fresh specimens. And the white-lipped snail, for the most part, is nocturnal. You see them at night. And so my son and I were in this section of woods that I know the white-lipped snail frequents. And we were there about 9 o'clock at night with flashlights. And we would find a mushroom, because the white-lipped snail also loves to eat mushrooms and mycelium. And so we would look at the mushrooms, and almost every mushroom we found in the woods at night had a salamander around it. And the salamanders were there, waiting for the night flying insects to come in. It was amazing. We didn't find any snails that night, but a lot of salamanders. And then the things that you always look for and hope you'll find in abundance, like the black trumpets. And if you started mushrooming last year, you're spoiled. You are just spoiled, because last year, black trumpets were all over the place in such abundance. And it's unlikely we'll have another year that abundant for a number. But keep looking where you found them last year. You may find more. Such a wonderful edible. And these yellowfoot chanterelles, the small ones that grow with beech and oak and sometimes hemlock, abundant last year. Lovely edible. And this one, I do some presentations and going to be offering some classes on the boletes. The boletes are a confusing group. They're very, they're complex because there's so much abundance, more abundance than most field guides give credence to. And so the little bicolor bolete or two-color bolete is a wonderful, one of my favorite edibles. But you have to know enough to be able to distinguish between it and a few lookalikes, some of which cause problems. But it's a beautiful, dense mushroom, cooks up nicely. And again, last year there were a bunch around. So we've kind of wandered through the world of mushrooms, the colors, the forms, the beauty, some edibles, not so much the toxics at this point. But let's talk about the function of mushrooms in the forest, in our environment. And, you know, if we didn't have them, if suddenly there was something swept through and took out all of the mycelium and the mushrooms, everything would grind to a halt. And let's talk about what that means. All fungi belong to a broad category of food source or food gatherers called heterotrophs. That means they need a food source. The autotrophs are things like green plants and a few things that use chemicals, you know, that make their food energy comes from a different source. But fungi need something to feed on. And going way back, you know, 300-400 million years ago, the fungi evolved coming out of the oceans along with plants. And they continued to evolve with plants on dry land. And early on, they took the place of their undertakers. And many fungi are saprobes. They rot things. They break down dead plant matter. And other mushrooms, other fungi are symbiotic. They're called mycorrhizal. Myco is fungal, rhizal is root. So fungus root, and we'll talk more about those. And they are symbiotic partners with roots of trees and other kinds of plants. And still others that are less impactful in terms of forest ecology are the parasites. Parasites on plants, parasites on other mushrooms. But we're going to focus mostly on the saprobes, the rotters, and the mycorrhizal, the symbiotic ones. And, you know, rarely is it all saprobe or all mycorrhizal. There's some interplay that goes back and forth throughout their life cycle. So we'll pay attention to that. So this photograph is a little Paniolus, a dung rotting mushroom that I found along a woods road in Lincolnville a few years ago. Pretty little mushroom. Some of those are actually psychoactive, though not this one. So let's talk about the rotters. As I said, you know, the many of the fungi evolved out of the primordial ocean to become the things that recycle and break down dead plant tissue. Nature's composters, right? And without the fungi playing that role, what would happen? Every year, grass and forbs and herbs and shrubs and trees would grow and leaf out and flower and produce seeds, and then they would go through a life cycle. The deciduous trees would drop their leaves in the fall and you would drop to the ground. And unless there was something that broke them down, pretty quickly, all of the mineral nutrients that were easily available in the soil would be bound up in dead plant tissue. And things would grind mostly to a halt. It's that leaf duff layer of the soil where all the fungus is very active that recycles that dead plant tissue to release the nutrients to be used again. So fungi are rotters. And this, I call this this carving Fungus King, because it really reminds me and looks a lot like Angus King, our state senator or our national senator. So this is his brother Fungus. And it's actually a sculpture by an artist named Tom Cowan, who lived up in the Belfast area. And this maple tree in Belfast, I guess it died, and the family commissioned Cowan to carve this this face. And so, like any good mycologist, I watched it, and I watched it. And when you have a dead log or, dead plant matter out there, it's like you're calling in the fungi to come and rot it. And over several years, I watched different groups of mushrooms begin to colonize and rot this plant or this tree. And you can see on the right-hand side of Fungus's face, that dark path was one of the latest waves. Early on, it was tremella, and for a while there was some oyster mushrooms on it. And then the artist fungus, the Ganoderma applanatum, began to colonize. You can see it fruiting on the right-hand side and at the bottom. And at that point, the family decided they were going to cut out the face to preserve it. But it was just for me. Fungus King was showing the evolution of rotting wood in a controlled environment. So as it was doing that, it was releasing the nutrients in that dead wood tissue so it can be used again. That's what they do. And we use them also, they play that role all the time in our compost, in our lawn, in our gardens, in our woods. And we also harness that in terms of bioremediation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I was watching this, I'm one of those strange people driving down the road. I look for those kinds of carvings along the way to see what was inhabiting it. And this is just outside, just to the east of Augusta along Route 17. I saw this chainsaw eagle sitting in the edge of this lawn. And then last summer, as I was driving through, I said, ooh, what is the mange on the back of that eagle? And you can see on that right-hand picture, he's kind of looking over saying, what the heck is this? It's Panis neostrigosus. It's a common wood rotter, and it really loved the back of that eagle last year. Remember, there is no stasis in nature. You drop something on the forest floor, something's going to begin to use it for food, for home. Yeah. And most of the major wood rotting fungi, we break down, particularly the foresters. They're really interested in wood rot from a place of that they're ruining on the integrity of our trees. And they break them down into either brown rotters or white rotters. And there's variations. Some actually break down both. And the white rotters break down the lignins and they leave the light colored cellulose. Hence what's left is why it's called white rot. And the brown rotters, they take out the light colored cellulose and they leave the darker lignins and hemilignins, the glue between the fibers of the wood. And so we classify the rotting types of fungi into the groups. But that's more than you probably want to know tonight. So we have fungus here again. And I want to acknowledge that, when a mushroom or the mushroom mycelium is breaking down the integrity of wood, it's softening it up, it's recycling the nutrients, it's also creating a better or more easily integrated habitat for homes for organisms. So I show fungus again because on the upper side of this one, you can see that small, perfectly round diameter woodpecker hole. So woodpeckers, as they go through the woods, they're going to feel here from the sound and the density of the wood, what trees have already been softened by fungus. And they're going to excavate them for the insects that are also tunneling through there, and they're going to excavate them for nesting boxes or nesting holes. So here's fungus showing a small woodpecker hole, and I think this was literally a month or two before they cut him off. And then this is on the upper right-hand side is Gliophilum Sepiarium on a spruce stump. And the one below, I just loved it because it's actually an aspen, a populus tree that had stapled onto it a shell fishing prohibition sign, and the fungus actually fruited right around the poster that was on there. On aspen, the artist can grow very rapidly because of the relatively less dense fibers of the wood. It colonizes it fast. So anyway, softening the wood and creating homes or creating the conditions for woodpeckers to dig out the holes, and then other cavity nesting, both birds and mammals to inhabit those holes as home. So on the left-hand side here, we have the hemlock that's colonized by the red-belted polypore. I don't know what colonized the spruce on the top there, but down below that aspen, you can see the fruiting bodies coming out the sides. It's a type of polypore called Phalinus tremulae, and it only is called the aspen polypore. And in the West, where they did a lot of studies to try and create habitat and increase the likelihood of nesting of some of the endangered or threatened woodpeckers, they noticed that these 85, 90-year-old aspens are large. The woodpeckers would selectively choose those that had the phalinus heart rot that softens it up, and they'd use those for their nesting cavities. Who says the woodpeckers aren't smart, huh? They don't just bang their head on trees randomly. And this is a little parasitic polypore called Chaga Benefits. And you can see the woodpecker hole at the base of this growth of chaga on this birch. Again, softening the wood. So of those saprobic mushrooms, the rotters, many of the ones that have really strongest history and some of the research around medicinal use are wood rotters. And if you think of it, a fungus that is evolved to rot wood has a large, stable food source. So it can grow more slowly. It can put more energy into the production of a leathery or even harder fruiting body or a larger fruiting body. And that time and energy put into a fruiting body can also translate into more structural elements that can be medicinal, or more secondary chemical components like terpenes that can have medicinal value. So here we have turkey tail, the tinder conch, and lion's mane or comb tooth, the hericium. Hericium is not tough and woody, but it can be quite large. So good medicinal mushrooms. And other wood rotters are some of our better, they're good edibles. I wouldn't say they're the better ones, including the shaggy mane on the left-hand side, which is one of my favorite kind of mid to late fall mushrooms. The umbrella polypore, Polyporus umbellatus, or Griffula umbellata, depending which taxonomy you follow. Which is not as common as I would like it to be in Maine. And then on the right-hand side, the giant puffball, in this case, the myopic variant of the giant puffball with the glasses on it. And things like hen of the woods and oyster mushrooms, saprobic, and the not edible, well, some people eat it when it's really, really young, but the medicinal reishi. And one more. And that is chicken of the woods. And I call this edible, but I also want to caution you about eating it. Some people, numbers, maybe 5% of people, it just doesn't agree with you. It'll make you sick. And if you don't cook it well, it'll definitely make you sick. It's toxic raw or undercooked. And if you eat it too old and leathery, I think that adds to that difficulty with digestion. This particular photograph is of a mushroom that I would call it right on the edge in terms of edible status. So remember, I was telling you about, those saprobic mushrooms, they rot things, and many of them, it's pretty easy for us at this point with the technology and the knowledge base we have to learn how to cultivate them. I used to do a lot of mushroom cultivation back in the 1980s, and I realized I was less interested being a farmer than I wanted to use that time out in the woods. So I let go of most of it, but I still cultivate the wine cap stropharia in between my raised beds of my vegetable garden on wood chips. And it is incredibly easy to cultivate. I was lucked into a very large load of maple wood chips, and it's a perfect growing medium. And I just spread them out and mixed it with the spawn, the mycelium of the wine cap. And literally, some of them were fruiting within about 8 weeks. And the great thing is, as they are feeding on the wood chips and breaking them down, they're turning those wood chips into really nice soil over time as well. So I had some new apple trees, and I would put a mound of wood chips around them, inoculate it, and so I'm quickly turning those into soil as well. So if you want to start growing mushrooms in your garden, that's a great one to start with. Oyster mushrooms are also very, very easy to cultivate. And that leads us to harnessing those same energies in the mushrooms. There we go. In terms of mycoremediation, the same ability to break down organic plant matter that many mushrooms have, the mycelium, can also be used to break down other types of hydrocarbons. And we learned, and I think it was Paul Stamets who really made this well known, that if you have soil or other matter that's contaminated with petroleum or petroleum waste, if you inoculate that with a vigorous variety of something like an oyster mushroom, the oyster mushroom will grow through that soil and actually feed on the hydrocarbons and break it down. So it turns contaminated soil into soil that is free of those hydrocarbons. Now, if it had a metal, heavy metal waste in the soil, it's a little more difficult to break down that. You won't break it down. You may sequester it in the fruiting bodies, but that would be it. So we've done a lot of work with the contaminated soil in areas where oil exploration is done. You can't do it if it's in water, because the fungi won't grow in water. But really, oil-fouled ground is really good, especially if you mix it with sawdust or straw, like they're doing here. And it helps to kind of rebuild soil in those areas. It's used a lot in areas after heavy timbering or a forest fire they will put down beds of straw or wood chips and then inoculate that. It keeps the erosion down and begins to start the soil rebuilding. So in this photograph, this is an area after a forest fire where they were really worried about not only erosion, but also the toxins that were in the fire ash. And so they built these wattle, netted, packed with straw and inoculated straw, and they build these so it both slows down the water, and then the contaminated water seeps through the wattle and it breaks it down as it's feeding, quote unquote, the mycelium. So another photograph of that same use in bioremediation coming out of Portland, Oregon, and you can see this was an area that was draining a place with high organic matter, might have been a septic outlay or livestock, and you want to break down some of the excess nitrogen-containing organics in that water, so you let it filter through a bed of soil and mulch that's enhanced with mycelium, and it breaks it down. Is it perfect? I think it needs to be carefully looked at, carefully designed and tended, but it can be quite effective. And in that same way, on the bottom right here, you see oyster mushrooms growing on the cotton of dungarees, and up above the same packed cloth bags filled with either sawdust or straw and mycelium that the water is seeping through. So bioremediation, and there's a lot of play with this. I think can be fairly labor intensive, but quite effective in a relatively I'm not going to say crude, but low technology efforts. So I want to let go of Jolene. here's a good question. Do you think Maine could utilize fungi to remediate PFAS problem? That's a really good question. There are some types of plastics that fungi can degrade and break down. I don't know about PFAS. That's a really good question. Someone do the research and let us know, okay? So I want to shift from those primary saprobic fungi into the ones that are more mutualistic, symbiotic. And I love the photograph of the bow and the arrow that says, come back, you're nothing without me. How do we work together? And every one of us, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, we live constantly in these overlapping relationships. How much have we learned about how much of my biomass is made up of microorganisms, not just my cells? So, and we are still very much in our infancy in terms of studying this. The ability to understand and, dissect and view the complexity of the chemical and physical relationships. We're babies. We're like giants, as I say, fumbling to unravel this delicate web of mystery. And it kind of brings the whole idea, and this is, John Donne's rewriting of No Person is an Island, which is that bastion of, we're supposed to be strong. It says, no person is an island entire of himself. Every individual is a piece of the community, a part of the time, the place, and the whole. If soil is washed away by the sea, we are all diminished, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if any matter of my friends or of your own were. Everything matters. Any creature's death diminishes me because I am involved in the health of the world. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee and me and we. And she said that, none of us exist alone. We cannot separate ourselves from the world. And so we're going to bring that through the lens of fungal mutualism. And here we're going to talk about mycorrhizal symbiotic partners. Myco meaning fungal, rhizal meaning root, right? And this photograph is that white-lipped snail, which I'm always on the lookout for. And he's wrapped around, and you can really see at the base there, he's been chewing on the base of this little Amanita frostii. So what we've learned is around 90% of all green plants form at least some form of mycorrhizal partnership. And it's a trading system, with the fungi bringing minerals and waters to the plant, and the plant sharing in some of the carbohydrates, the sugars that it creates through photosynthesis into the mycelium of the fungus. And these complex relationships, our forests depend upon them. They depend upon them. And what we know, 85% of the dicotyledonous plants, almost 80% of the monocots, and even more so, 95% or more of the conifers form these kinds of relationships. And you can think of that fungi as an extended root system. And I'll show you some photographs in a second. That root system brings in water and nutrients to the plant in exchange for sugars. So this is a very famous photograph, and it's on the cover of a book called Mycorrhizal Symbiosis, Smith and Reed. And if you look closely at this, you can see the larger seedling of the pinus. The roots come down, a central root and a couple of offshoots. And the roots are relatively limited in how much of that soil it infiltrates. But all around it is this complex network of finer white mycelium, the building blocks of the fungus. And in this case, the fungus is a type of bolete, Swillus bovinus. So everywhere along the root where you see a little nodule, a little brighter area, that's where that mycelium connect with the root, and then in the exchange of mineral nutrients and carbohydrates happen. And later, they planted 2 more seeds. And there are two smaller seedlings in this mix. And you can already see that coming down from those smaller seedlings, the fungus is colonizing them as well. So the same fungus, one individual mycelial colony, is engaged with more than one plant. And if you can extrapolate this, if you can think of how this rests in a forest where there are a number of different species of fungus where the mycelium are interacting with the trees, and some of those are interacting with a number of different tree species. And one tree might have those fungal relationships with a number of different species of mushrooms. So that just scratches the surface of the complexity. So it's been postulated that anytime you're walking across the forest floor, you're literally walking across miles of those strands of mycelium in the soil duff layer. So there are two, and you probably never have to remember this after tonight, there are two major types of this mycorrhizal associations. There's the ectomycorrhizal, where, like the ones I just showed you, where the mycelium sheaths are around the root. And then there's the endomycorrhizal, where the mycorrhizae actually grow into the root and into the cells themselves. And the ectomycorrhizal are the only ones that make mushrooms that are visible that we can see and collect. The endomycorrhizal belong to a whole class of fungi. It's called glomerales, and they fruit underground, these little tiny, or actually large spores, but never make fruiting bodies. So we never notice them, but they're quite active. So in our forest would not be able to function without these mycorrhizal associations in the same way that it would get bound up if it didn't have the rotters breaking down the dead tissue. So it helps to stimulate and support root growth, helps roots to establish faster. You can do mycorrhizal inoculants in your gardens for the same reason. Helps them to absorb nutrients more efficiently and increases the biomass. So higher uptake of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients, and better water absorption, more effective and efficient water absorption. All that is happening. So in this photograph, and it's not real, it's an animation, but you can see in the center of this the main roots of that plant, and then it kind of is the drawn out, the very, very fine tissue surrounding those roots is the fungal mycelium. And then those hyphae are much smaller than even the smallest root. And so they can get in between the grains of soil to be more effective and efficient at collecting nutrients. And again, since we are just really trying to understand the studying of these, this is a crude example of the green here being the mycorrhizal partnerships with the roots of a couple of different trees. And it shows that even across different species of trees, you can have this transfer of carbon, of information, of nutrients. And then on the left-hand side, you can see one of the saprobic mushrooms, or rotters, breaking down the leaf duff. So very simplified version of what we see in the woods. We learned slowly about the mycorrhizal associations. And one of the ways we really learned about it and noticed it is almost 150 years ago, when we began to plant forests in Australia and New Zealand. Their native trees were a little bit too twisty to make good timbers. And so we started bringing in seedlings of pine and planting them. And the seedlings did really well. So well that they encouraged them, and they started their own nurseries, and they got the seeds and they germinated them, and they planted the seedlings out into the forest, and they languished. And they said, wow, it worked so well when we had them with the soil from home. There must be some magic in that soil. And so for a while, before they learned what was going on, they actually would transfer, they would bring in shiploads of soil to plant with these seedlings, and they did well. And they said, there must be some magic there. What is it? And as a German microbiologist really began to unravel that there's something growing there that did it. It's not the soil, but it's what's inhabiting the soil. And they learned about the fungi. And so in areas where, and this picture here is of a former farm field that it was growing potatoes, and they had a bad potato blight. And so they fumigated the soil, killed everything. And they said, great, now we can plant trees. And the trees did really well for the first year, and then they languished. And they realized, because we've killed off all the mycelium here. And then they started to see little islands of brilliant growth as the fungal partners began to establish themselves with the roots. So we learned slowly how vital these partnerships are in our cultivated trees and in our forests. And again, since it's always more complex than we assume, I want to talk about the story of the ghost pipe, or Indian pipe, as I learned it as growing up. This beautiful, pure white, sometimes a little bit of pink in them, plant that we see in the forest pretty commonly in clusters. And when I first went to naturalist training camp back in 1973, they described these as saprobes, that they must gather their food by rotting the duff. What we've learned is far, far more complex. So the Indian pipe grows with the mycelium of various species within the genus Ruschula. And the Indian pipe is a parasite on pulling nutrients from the Ruschula. But remember, the Ruschula is getting its nutrients from the trees that it partners with, because it's mycorrhizal. And so you've got a tree that's feeding the mycelium of the Ruschula, which brings it nutrients, and the Indian pipe kind of kicking into that partnership to pull nutrients out. So they call it a Mycoheterotroph, very fancy term. But as we go further, we've learned that there's something in the Indian pipe that stimulates the growth of the mycelium. So it must be putting some benefits into the mix as well. Again, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the complexity here. Mycoheterotroph, remember that when you're taking your children or your grandchildren into the woods. So of the mycorrhizal relationships, the mycorrhizal mushrooms, there's a bunch of them that we love as edibles. Some of them are really toxic. All of the boletes, for the most part, are mycorrhizal. And anything that's growing in that kind of complex relationship, you're going to be thinking about as you're wanting to understand where it's going to grow or where to expect it. What partners, what trees does it partner with? That's the habitat I want to look in. So the boletes of all kinds, including the 5 or 6 species that we group together and call the king boletes, or the porcini, or steinpilz, or pinnibun, that wonderful edible. And they grow, they're somewhat generalist with different species, but you're going to learn, where they grow. And the one thing you're going to remember, if you find them in one area, remember, they're partnering with those trees. In similar rain conditions, temperature conditions, they're going to fruit there again in the future. Maybe not every year, but that's where you're going to look for them. And along with the king bolete, I have to throw in, from my poisoning background, I want people to learn Boletes heronensis. It doesn't even have a common name that I'm aware of. And some people mistake it for the king bolete, to their demise. Not demise, it doesn't kill them, but boy, it makes you really, really sick for a number of hours. So learn them as you start to say, I want to learn king boletes. I want my porcini. Learn the Boletes heronensis as well. So this is how trees communicate, Rod. You're right. They talk to each other chemically through the ground. It's their nervous system. Now, how complex that is, we're still learning, aren't we? Depends on who you ask. So of the mycorrhizal include all the Cortinarius, all the Lactarius and milk caps, all the Ruchulas, all of the Amanitas, and a whole bunch other, including many of the truffles, the underground fruiting bodies as well. And it includes anything in the chanterelle group. The black trumpets and the chanterelles are all mycorrhizal. If you are one of those people who says, well, I have my chanterelle patches, I have where I collect them every year, it's because they have those partnerships with the plants. But we have to pay attention. What is likely to damage that partnership? And anything that really disrupts that leaf duff where they're actively growing with the roots, that can damage them. And so there are some people in the fall, people are out in the woods, particularly hemlock woods, looking for the matsutake. And they want them when they're just buttons emerging. And some of them will rake the soil looking for them as they emerge. That's a problematic. That's not responsible foraging. Some people do the same with truffles. Again, that's going to disrupt the relationships and hurt fruiting into the future. Short-term gain. Any cutting of trees, if you have your favorite hillside for chanterelles, as I had one that I called chanterelle heaven, if the trees are heavily cut, that's going to disrupt those relationships for a number of years. I'm finally going back to that hillside some years later and starting to find the same variety of chanterelles that I love on that hillside. Anything that really compacts the soil, like skidders or trail bikes or something like that, is going to disrupt it. And what we didn't know for a long time, excess fertilizer, including runoff from agricultural areas or cities, and the nutrient imbalance caused by acid rain. We've noticed, in Europe, especially Central Europe, the numbers and the biomass of chanterelles were falling for years. And of course, who did they blame first? Those damn mushroomers. But really, it was the excess nutrients coming into the forest. And if the trees say, I don't need to partner with this fungus anymore, I can get the nutrients freely through my roots because they're so abundant, it breaks down some of that partnershipping. Partnershipping, is that a word? You understand what I mean. And if you're interested in more information on mycorrhizal associations and their use in the world, the book here by Michael Phillips, and unfortunately the late Michael Phillips, he died just this past 6 months or so abruptly. It's a really nice book, well written by a New Englander. His love and specialization were with apples, but he also did an excellent job here with this book. So pick it up. So beyond the mycorrhizal, beyond the saprobes, the role of fungi in our forests, in our worlds, is food. Food for so many different creatures. Bacteria, molds, other things, the microorganisms that break them down. Invertebrates who use them for food, much to our disgust at sometimes when we're trying to find something without the tunnels in it. Rodents, deer, rabbits. Look, particularly in a dry year when there's not a lot of oak massed in the forest, deer will really go after some species of mushrooms. They love honey mushrooms. They love matsutake. They'll eat some boletes. Rodents do. In fact, flying squirrels, those beautiful nocturnal squirrels, they feed very, very heavily on mushrooms. In fact, they'll collect them, and if you see mushrooms hanging in the crooks of branches in the forest, it's the flying squirrels that will dry them, and then they'll put them in their hollows in the trees to store them for the winter or into the winter. And certainly, they're food for man. And also, because they're food for so many things, they build up toxins to try and prevent that. So some of our favorite mushrooms, certainly we've talked about a couple of these, the chanterelles, the shaggy manes, which is grand mushroom, all of some of the better boletes. But remember, even this photograph, you have to be aware that boletes and some of the amanitas might be fruiting from that same associated trees. And these were fruiting right together, the Amanita muscaria, which is toxic, and the king bolete. And the amanitas, as I said, they're all mycorrhizal. Some of them are very, very deadly. The ones in the bottom right here, Amanita magnivalaris, it's one of the destroying angels, very deadly. And the Amanita muscaria is certainly a psychoactive, not one that I would recommend, certainly, as for psychoactivity. But yes, even those mushrooms, the shrooms, are pretty active as saprobes in our forest environment. The laughing Gymnopolis luteus, is very common growing on wood in our forests and are pretty active in terms of psilocin and psilocybin. And I'm loving some of the clinical work and the careful approach to the use of psychoactives in mental health and mind expansion. It's a lot of work. It's a little fatty for my taste, a little too fatty, but I really appreciate the excitement around them. Interesting, the psilocybin, psilocin are quite effective for cluster headaches, I understand. And here's a psilocybe quebecensis, which I found fruiting very, very heavily for several years in one area in Knox Waldo County. So here we go. And we come back to it, into the forest you go, to lose my mind and find my soul, the words of John Muir. And when we come right back down to it, all the learning, all the gathering, all the foraging, it's a place of peace. So I see Jolene says Canada just expanded the use of psilocybin. Is that the legal use of it or the clinical use, Jolene? Don't know. Bye, Melissa. So I want to just spend a couple more minutes, particularly for anybody here who's interested in foraging and are new at it. Just a little rough guidelines for someone who's new. And the first, I want to talk about responsible, sustainable foraging. Unless you own that forest, you don't have a right to all the mushrooms in it. In fact, unless you own the forest, you really should have permission to collect someone's mushrooms at all. And my experience is when I've knocked on a door and said, hey, this is who I am. I'm really wondering if you would mind. Almost never have I had someone say, no way, Jose. So ask. And only take what's prime, young, firm, good for food, and leave the rest to mature. Leave at least, I always say, I never take more than half of what's there at the most. And I love this sign that was posted on Reddit, no mushroom hunting, go away. They're mine, they're all mine. So people get very territorial about their mushroom spots, but do it responsibly, do it sustainably for both the owner of the land and the forest itself. So if you're going in to dive into mushrooms, before you ever collect mushrooms for food, find a way to learn them. Learn the edible ones, learn the toxic ones. If you do well with field guides, there's some excellent field guides out there. Join a mycological association. Maine's got a quite active one. The Maine Mycological Association costs all of about $12 a year. There are some good mushroom Facebook sites. We recognize that the person that might first identify your mushroom isn't always the most knowledgeable. Be patient, let the group show, always be cautious about what you eat based on somebody else's identification. It's your responsibility. If you can, find someone in your area who you trust, whose judgment and skill-based you're aware of, and befriend them because they can become your mentor and they can help your learning curve in a responsible way. What you don't do You don't say, hey, can I hang out in the woods with you? Because I know you know great places to go mushrooming. Can I, and by the way, can you show me your favorite fishing hole too? You don't want to do that. But you can say, hey, I've got this place, these woods behind my house. If you come back and take a walk with me, I'll make you dinner. If you like that really chewy, fruit-forward red wine, I'll bring you a couple of bottles of it. Make them smile when they see you coming. Now, once you start collecting, never, ever, ever, ever treat mushrooming as an extreme sport. Don't try and find the longest life list of mushrooms I've eaten, because sooner or later you're going to get sick. So stay safe, start slow. Collect only from uncontaminated ground, no heavily traveled roadsides, no railway right-of-ways. As I said before, collect only young prime mushrooms for food, but if you're identifying them, make sure you get all stages and ages and all parts of the mushroom. Learn how to do a spore print, learn the skills to identify. And this is not an identification class, by the way. And then when you start eating mushrooms, you never eat a mushroom unless you're 100% sure of the mushroom and its edibility. And then always cook a mushroom well. Never eat a mushroom raw. They're hard for us to digest, and some really grand edibles are toxic when they're raw, like morels, or the chicken of the woods, honeymoons, or bluets. So cook them well. If you're eating new mushrooms, only eat one species at a time. If you go out and you find 7 different species of edibles and you throw them in a pot and you cook them up and you eat them and you get sick, you'll never eat any of those 7 mushrooms again. Sad. So one at a time, a little bit initially. Make sure it suits you well. And be cautious sharing it with people that have vulnerable health. Be slow. And when I served wild mushrooms to somebody, I always tell them, this is the mushroom. I foraged it myself, and I let them have total choice whether they eat it or not. And if they're nervous and they force themselves to eat it and they get sick, it might be because of their nervous stomach. So give them choice, because if they don't eat it, it's just more for you. So in terms of resources, think about the books you might get. There's some really good books out there in field guides. Join the main Mycorrhizal Association. There's several good Facebook sites, and feel free, if anybody has their favorite sites, they can pop them into the chat. Rod, you asked about the concerns about railways. They often do a lot of spraying to keep down plants, and those sprays can be quite toxic. That's what worries me about railways. So go slow, have fun, and make sure that when you're out there, you're not so focused on filling your stomach that you don't fill your soul. Enjoy the wild. A couple books that I have, Mushrooms for Health is about medicinal mushrooms and the use of them. It's not available in print now, but it's still available in Kindle. And Chanterelle Dreams, Amanita Nightmares is a romp through the world of mushrooms, and certainly widely available still. So I'm going to leave it here. There's a number of books that I would recommend. And I just want to make you aware, I do a number of classes and presentations like this, as well as day-long classes. I've just got an agreement to head out to Hurricane Island for a weekend mushrooming seminar, 3 days or 2.5 days. Should be a lot of fun in mid-August. And my friend Michaeline and I will be back at Eagle Hill for our 5-day intensive mushrooming for the novice, which is we affectionately call mushroom camp, as well as a number of 1-day seminars around the state. So I'm hoping to pull together a pop-up bolete identification workshop, but I have to choose the time when the boletes are around, as well as maybe a cooking class late summer, early fall. So don't be strange. Feel free to email me, and we'll get them out in the world. Is that Bill Ewell I see in the chat? Hello, Bill. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for any questions you might have. That way I can give Bill Ewell a hard time. You're welcome, Jolene. Nice to have you here. So questions. You can feel free to unmute if you're an extrovert. Feel free to put it into the chat if you're not.
I have a question.
Sure, Ann.
So I hope I have my camera on because I look terrible right now. Anyway.
Unfortunately, I can't see you.
Okay, good. So what you said about if there's too much fertilizer that can destroy, you know, mushroom habitat, we'll say. I had an experience where I got way too much nitrogen in some beds.
Mm-hmm.
And the first sign or indication that I had a problem was that mushrooms started growing like mad.
But what species of mushrooms?
I don't know, but I had them everywhere in all the beds.
So if your nitrogen was from an organic source like compost, oh yeah, there's some mushrooms that love that. It's the mycorrhizal, those symbiotic relationships that get slowed down by too much nutrients.
Okay. So it could have been, I'm not positive, but it could be from some compost that wasn't actually composted.
Yeah, and so you're going to get rotting mushrooms. You might get, you know, any of the inky caps. There's a number of things that can grow on that, but that's different than the mycorrhizal mushrooms, Ann.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Rod, good to see you, sir.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for doing this, Greg. I've read a few things about mushrooms as prebiotics, not to be confused with probiotics. What do you think of mushrooms as prebiotics? And if there's anything to it, what mushrooms might be good for that?
Well, I want you to first define prebiotic for me.
Not much. It's just supposed to help with digestion, kind of like probiotics. I read stuff all the time. The research seems equivocal.
Yeah.
They might help, they might not, but it's like mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And from the little stuff that I have read, it says prebiotics are just kind of like precursors to digestion, and they help with that biome, I guess, in the gut. Kind of like probiotics, but pre instead.
Beats the hell out of me, Rod.
Okay.
Yeah, have no idea. Anybody here know something about that?
All right, thanks. Anyways.
You bet. Other thoughts or questions? Hi, Kelly. I see your face down there in.
I have a question. You've
George.
recommended a couple of books on mushrooms, but do you have any recommendations on books about other plants in the forest to help identify ally plants?
I'm going to leave that to someone who knows more about that and more recent. Boy, there's plenty of great botanists out there. Actually, we've got a really good, deep naturalist on this. Bill Ewell, what books would you recommend for someone who wants to learn the forest plants these days? I think ones in my head are pretty old.
I don't know if my microphone's on.
It's on.
I recommend anything by Bernd Heinrich
Oh, yes.
or Tom Wessels.
Bernd Heinrich is a wonderful naturalist. Divides his time between Vermont and Maine, and he's a wonderful writer. Yeah.
Yeah, Greg, The Trees in My Forest.
Yeah.
That's my favorite Bernd Heinrich. And anything Tom Wessels writes or any Tom Wessel YouTube video, I would recommend.
Great. Thank you, Bill.
Hi, Greg.
Yeah,
So-
wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Spencer. Rod, did you have another question, or is your hand just still up?
Sorry, I don't have another question.
All right. Yeah, those people that know the way to raise your hand is, boy, you can get your attention pretty quickly that way, huh? So I don't need to belabor you and make you ask questions, but I'm happy to hang about for a little bit longer and chat if you have any questions. A form of dietary fiber that feed friendly bacteria. Rod, mushrooms are a wonderful source of fiber because there's so much of those glucans and proteinated glycans, those really complex polysaccharides that our gut doesn't break down. So that's probably what they mean. And depending on the mushroom, the percentage of that kind of fiber in them can be quite high. In fact, some people have trouble eating hen of the woods because it binds them up because there's too much fiber. So you have to be cautious around that.
I have a
Did-
question.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yes, please.
My friend Dina is asking a question about rare fungi, red list fungi, and the fact that fungi get such low exposure in terms of endangered species, that kind of thing.
Deanna, I think that we don't understand well enough. I've never seen a good treatment or write-up on what fungi are endangered. We're beginning to embrace the concept of invasive fungi. I mean, the Amanita muscaria in parts of Australia and New Zealand are considered invasive because they can outcompete some of the native fungi. But boy, I don't think we have a really good understanding of that. And one of the things that I revel in is I may go a number of years without seeing certain species of fungi, and then come a year where I see them in scattered places all over the state, where I haven't seen them maybe for 8 or 10 or 12 years. So the periodicity of fruiting of fungus is quite complex in some species. Chanterelles, you expect to see those every year, but others, like that blue albatrellus that I had a picture of, many years I don't see that at all. And then like last year, I saw it in almost every mature hemlock forest I was in.
Yeah,
So,
me too.
yeah.
I have a question.
David, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much. This is the second of your lectures I've participated in, and you're marvelous. Thank you so much. But how does one keep track of you so we're aware of other stuff you're doing that we can participate in, or classes that you're going to be offering?
David, if you send me an email,
Right.
I'll add you. I have a distribution list, and I'm a horrible marketer. I try and do that. And if you look on the NAMI main website, you can see what mushroom or what suicide prevention trainings I'm doing around the state. But I think that's a different field.
Well, you never know. So, all right, thank you. I'll do that.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm on. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Yes. Hi. I took a college course at UMFK on fungi, and we used the book North American Mushrooms, this book here.
Yes.
And I think it's great. I use a few different books. I'm really by no means an expert, although some people, they send me messages, text messages and messengers saying, oh, what's this mushroom? What's that mushroom? But really, I only know a handful that I'm really absolutely positive of. And we used iNaturalist when we took the course. It's an app.
Yeah.
And you can take a picture, and then it tells you also the GPS for it, where it is, and you're able to put notes into it. And somehow I just felt like I couldn't trust some of the people that were responding to identifying that. Like, they're banking their photos there, and they were, having a place to file it. But I wasn't really sure if they were really accurate. Do you have any apps that you can recommend that you feel comfortable using?
So Rose, are you still up in Aroostook County?
Yeah, we're up in Cross Lake area.
All right.
Mhm.
So it's not well, there's an app and a website. What I use a lot is the Myco-Quebec, which is the Mycological Consortium up in Quebec. And they have an app. It's the only app I have on my phone. It's all in French is the challenge.
Oh,
But my French is horrible and I find it incredibly useful. I use it probably more than any other website around.
wow.
Check that out.
That's good to know. I
Yeah.
would love to be able to like connect with the people across the border. They've just lightened the crossing now. You don't only need your vaccination card. You don't need to show proof of testing. That just I just found that out today. So that's kind of nice that, you know, there's people maybe in Edmonston or, you know, in the surrounding area that, you know, I know there are groups over there, but and bird groups, all kinds of groups, but with the pandemic, you know, we haven't been able to cross easily. So
Right,
thank
but,
you
you know,
for that piece of information. I'll have
Quebec
to
has
learn
some
French.
excellent- Yes, yes, definitely. Quebec has some excellent mycologists, and they do good work. They're opinionated and vocal, and I love
You're
that kind of
talking
stuff.
about the province, not specifically in Quebec City, just the
Correct,
province.
it's the province. So I think the biggest group of them are around Quebec City. Yeah.
Nice. That's nice to know. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Been very helpful. I've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Who else?
That
I love-
question?
I love mushroomers.
Mhm.
And the great thing about mushrooms, it's a lifelong learning opportunity. You know, the more I learn, the more I realize I have no idea what I'm doing. And many people consider me an expert, but there's more to learn. There's more layers, there's more learning. And of course, if you get into taxonomy, you have to relearn it about every 5 or 10 years anyway, because they change the names. But, you know, it's a wonderful opportunity. Miss Hoot.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me?
I can.
Excellent. I wanted to touch back on the topic of endangered species. I'm always very curious about how would one determine whether or not a mushroom exists if you're only able to see the fruiting body? Are people doing like research on plant or soil samples to find the mycelium? Or are they?
They're doing some of that. You know, we started doing that, you know, way back in 1992, you know, one of that great explosion, the belief that, you know, the honey mushroom mycelium were the largest critter in the world. They did that because this research group put popsicle sticks in the soil and in a wider and wider area, and they to determine what fungi the mycelium were colonizing those popsicle sticks. And so we're still really crude. We're using now more DNA research to do that, but it's still, you know, we're the giants trundling across the spider web to try and study it.
And what might lay deeper?
Exactly, yeah. So there you go. There's your life learning.
There's my next research project.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
Dr. Nadeau, do you have another question?
I do hope you hear my cat puking in the background. Sorry. It's about chaga. It's another mushroom that I've tried to learn more about, but it just seems shrouded in mystery, and it's like not a, like the FDA doesn't say there's a serving amount.
Yeah.
It's hard to find reliable research on it. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are of chaga, what the benefits are, if there are any, and how do we find reliable resources and how to figure this stuff out?
Boy, I think that's more than one question.
Sorry.
I started using chaga probably now, at least 20 years ago. And I use it particularly through the winter as a beverage. I don't know what's a dosage amount. I never pay attention to that. I use it, I probably, when I'm under stress or in the middle of winter, I may drink it a couple of cups a day. And for me, it has been a wonderfully reliable way to avoid catching what had been prior every year bronchitis. So it's a nice anti-inflammatory, it's a gentle immune stimulant. And you'll find, yeah, and you'll find people that claim that it does everything, include housebreak their dog. Yeah, that's out there, but you have to weed through it. A lot of the research, the older research was done in Russia. More recently, there's a lot of ongoing research in Korea and parts of Japan. Yeah. Don't ask me about dosage. Who the hell knows?
Thank you.
And I worry about chaga, particularly the further south you go, it's easily over harvested. I worry about it getting well over harvested. Further north in Maine, further western Maine, up into Canada, still very, very common.
Just a quick follow-up on that question. Who could tell us about dosage? Who is an expert on dosage?
That's a really good question. I don't know. What are you looking for it to do? Are you looking for it as a preventative, or are you looking for it for treatment? If it's a preventative, what are you worried about dosage for? If you're worried about treatment of something, then boy, you're beyond me.
I guess mostly just making something that is a viable thing versus something that might be I'm overdoing it. Mostly just want to make sure I'm getting enough.
So what I have done for many, many years, I have a 2-gallon pot, enamel pot on my stove. And I fill that pot with cold water. And into that pot, I put about 2 tablespoons of dried ground chaga. And I bring that to a boil, just up to a simmering boil, and I let it simmer for maybe up to a half an hour. And then I turn it off. And then I drink that chaga over the next however long it takes. If I'm using it a lot, it might take 3, 4, 5 days. Sometimes it's a week or 10 days. And then I'll repeat the process. And at some point, there's going to be too much chaga grounds in the bottom, and I'll pour it all off. But I'm pretty casual, but it works very well for me and my family. Is that dosage? No. It's how I use it and have used it for 20 years.
That's a start for being helpful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Do you have any foraging workshop plans in this area? Sue, where is this area? Rockland? That's where I'm sitting. Sue? I have foraging workshops. I've got one planned at Mary Spring. I've got maybe 2 at Hidden Valley Nature Center in outside of Damariscotta. I've got one in Bethel, a couple others that are in the works in various places. I can't remember. Oh, one at the Zinscott Farm in Turner, maybe 2, maybe a second one in September there. Yeah, at this point, I'm still working on some others. It's my weekend hobby. George, sir.
Unmute. Yes, I didn't know I pushed the button there. A couple things. Right now, I am taking some chaga. I've come up with my own amount. It seems to be similar to what you do. I weighed it out to about 7 grams, which comes out to about 2 to 3 tablespoons ground up in a coffee mill with 2 quarts of water, and let it steep on the back of the stove for 3 or 4 hours. And then it sits in the refrigerator, and I take it every now and then. Anecdotal evidence, not really positive, but I took it for a period of 3 or 4 months, and I lowered my PSA numbers. That's one thing. The other thing right now is we're doing the birch polypore, fomatosis, bedilla, and everybody says it's so darn bitter. I love it.
Huh.
And it has a nice, strong mushroom flavor. If I'm eating light stuff during the day, that I can taste it all day long. Just got done drilling 500 shiitake plugs into some black oak. I'm at the point where I still like to get out in the woods, but I can't get there as much as I like to, so I'm doing a little farming. I have to say, down here in Washington County, although yet last year was the best year almost on record for the rest of the state. I was still in a drought down here. I waited for things. I didn't see any black trumpets. I got my normal chanterelles. I actually was, I have to be thankful. I had some boletes right in my own yard. They were lovely. And dried most of the stuff, and it's just lovely to throw it into a soup now and again or wherever it goes. That's
Sure.
about it. Oh, the one other thing, in the beginning of mushroom hunting, it all seems so overwhelming. The woods are full of mushrooms. But as time progresses and you go for a ways, you begin to identify some, and then they're not all, it's not as overwhelming by incremental stages until you begin to recognize a lot of what's out there and find more is helpful than it. I mean, you can do something with, and those you have to watch out for, but know them first. That's about it. And thank you very
George,
much.
At the end there, that's wonderful guidance. Yeah, because it does. There's, if you think about it, how many bird species do I have in Maine? How many mushroom species? Mushroom species approaching 2,000. That's a lot to learn, but start incrementally, as George says. Foolproof few first for edibility. Learn the common toxic ones. Learn the beautiful ones. Learn the ugly ones. Learn the smelly ones. Learn the larger, easily identified ones. Stay away from the little brown ones other than to admire them. Yeah. So I think we're probably closing in on 7:30. Em probably wants to close us down and say goodnight. So I really appreciate the questions. That always makes it fun. And thank you for joining us today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much to Greg for such a fascinating talk, and to everyone for joining. And have a good rest of your night, everybody.
You too. Rod, take care.
Thank you very much.
Kelly, take care of yourself.